Welcome to a Cannaconvo episode of Cannabis Last Week, brought to you by Global Cannabis Times. I'm your host, John Puro. Before we get to an awesome interview, I need to note that any opinions I express are my own and not those of my law firm, Zuber Lawler, because when I'm not fighting crime by night as a mass vigilante, I practice law during the day. And when I'm not podcasting, I guess I should say too. So before we start, I also, Scott, you got to bear with me, like to do my customary quick prayer to the video chat gods. May our Wi-Fi connections be sturdy, all dogs and children remain quiet, and may Amazon Prime another time. Amen. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Scott Berman. To give a little bit of background, Scott is a co-founder and president of the Panther Group. He joined the Panther Opportunity Fund, which is a vintage cannabis-focused venture capital fund with a complementary and diverse set of a number of portfolio companies. It says there are 7, maybe that's grown since then, in 2017 as a principal, and then a member of the investment committee. So the Panther team is now also managing the Panther Micro Fund, which is actively deploying capital into new cannabis companies. Scott, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Scott, I have to confess, right, it's going to take a Herculean effort on my part to not actually talk about the last sentence in your bio, that you've been statistician for the Philadelphia 76ers home games since 1988 to the present. So I'll just leave it at this, right? As a Hinkite, as a Hinkyite, right? I'll just say that I'm very, very pleased that the phrase trust the process has gone into like the nationwide lexicon. I feel like that's one of the things I say most often in terms of sayings outside of unexpectedly, don't hate the player, hate the game in the rough and tumble cannabis industry. So yes, we're restraining ourselves, but really excited to have you on because I think that you have a very unique overview of the industry and, different than other, guests that we've had on the podcast that are, executives of brands or MSOs or SSOs. And so, we're happy to have you here to give your perspective. And in terms of things that we wanted to discuss, this is such an idiosyncratic industry, right? With each state being a self-contained unit because of no interstate commerce, the federal, legality issues. And so, as I've learned with the podcast and covering all of the industry, politics, obviously, we're seeing it in New York, we've seen it in Ohio this year, has such an impact, in each state on the industry, on investment opportunities. So I'd be curious to know how that affects your analysis, and just a general overview of the industry.
Yeah, it's really the most important thing that we look at when we're trying to figure out about an investment. And the interesting thing about it is, literally it's 1996, this process started with medical cannabis in California, and we still have certain states that don't have it, and then we have 38 or 39 medical states, and they're all at a different timing and horizon. We have the adult use states, which are coming on rapidly. And so it's really important to understand what's happening in each state and understand, which sectors are the right timing to invest in. Like, for example, like cultivation is an early investment in many states. Distribution is an early investment, but some of the other things like the brands take longer to develop, and the ancillary business might take longer. So we look at each one individually and then look at the specific sector so that we can decide when and how to invest.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it's interesting also. What I'm realizing is no regulatory body in any state is as staffed up as they should be, right? Yes. Ultimately, right? There are just, when you're talking about the government, there are limited resources. And so I think as you're referring to some of, the immediate focuses, what did Jersey do, right? They focused on, say, the 3, some of the essential parts for their initial temporary, right? Partial regulations, right? Focus on the grow, focus on who's going to sell. And then they're going to be rolling out some of these other models. To talk about some of these models, this isn't necessarily based on politics, right? But it is to a certain extent in terms of stigmas. Do you find on-site consumption interesting? Do you find delivery, which is now becoming a more essential element as states come online? Do you find those to be interesting? Politics, I think, probably plays into those as well. Be curious to know your thoughts on those.
Both are definitely interesting. I think on-site consumption is definitely going to grow in different places, and it's going to become very popular. And so I think Nevada's like leading on that one, and we'll hopefully see good results out there. As far as delivery goes, I think it's really important. And you bring up New Jersey as an example. In New Jersey, about half of the municipalities have said no to cannabis. And once they say no, they can't do it for like I think 2 years till they can opt back in. However, delivery though, so if you live in a town that doesn't have a store, but the town, 20 minutes away does, then delivery is going to become your main way of getting it. You're not going to want to drive too far to the dispensary, but delivery is going to be huge. So I think that's going to come on strong. We've seen in California that delivery is a big deal. There's a lot of delivery companies and they serve different regions. And I think that that's going to play out in many other states.
Yeah. Well, here's the other thing that's always like, is becoming an increasingly political issue as states come online is, how to combat the illicit market, right? When there was unequal enforcement of laws.
Yes.
Right. And so there's the social equity component, like New York is talking about bringing legacy to legal. And this is such, you talk about the stat that I always say, like, burned itself into my soul was in 2020, in New York, an arrest for marijuana possession, 94% were, Black and brown, despite obviously being a minority of the overall citizenship, not even getting into disparities in sentencing. So you have this, emphasis on this, increasingly with legitimate considerations for social equity and dampening it. And so delivery makes sense, right? Because that's how people are used to getting their weed, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so it's important, but as you said, if it starts coming into your borders when you opted out, that's not going to be fun necessarily. Politicians are not going to dig that. So the other thing I think also with, on-site consumption, here's something I'd ask you, right? Tourism, canna-tourism, and on-site consumption and all these states coming online, with your macro view of everything for the amount of time that you've been in the industry, down the road, do you think that canna-tourism is going to just shift to the states where tourism is popular? Like New York comes online with on-site consumption. New York is a huge tourism destination, right? Is Colorado an early entrant going to see less canna-tourism, right? As the more standard tourist destinations outside of the cannabis industry come online. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, and that's why I think Vegas is going to be one of the top canna-tourism places and the on-site consumption for sure. I think like in the summertime, like the East Coast, like the New Jersey, Atlantic City, New Jersey is a good example. They're trying to turn that into a canna-tourism place. So I think that places that people normally flock to, when you add cannabis in as an activity that you can do there, I think that's going to really help. If it's not a really good tourism, place to begin with, I don't think it's going to do as well.
So you think that essentially the destigmatization, the normalization is, we talked about the alcohol, industry, how, we use it as a talking point when we're talking about how marijuana is so much less harmful than alcohol, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately we're evolving to a point, and it may take some time, where it is treated the same essentially as any other, as the other main recreational drug that's out there, and the popular bar spots, those are going to be, where tourism happens. So you think that's where we're going to end up?
Absolutely. And when I first got involved in politics and cannabis, we had a saying. It said, "Regulate marijuana like alcohol." That was the political message on the ballot initiatives. And really it makes a lot of sense. And, it's actually marijuana should be regulated in a better way than alcohol. But let's just get us to that point, where everything's licensed, everything's tested, and you have to be an approved operator to sell it. You also brought up an interesting point about the legacy market and the illegal markets, because we also have a different scene for taxes in every particular state has a different tax structure. And that's what really affects a lot of the legacy markets. As you know, California, it's still probably 50% of the cannabis sales are illegal. And I have a lot of friends out there and they're like, it's just too expensive to buy it in a store. I'd rather just get it from my guy. And I think that what they've tried to do in New Jersey is have a much more sensible tax rate. We'll see how it plays out. New York is its own situation now with a lot of illegal cannabis being sold every day now on the streets of New York City. And so that's an interesting development there too. So I think it's really fascinating to see how much it converts and the stigma is part of it too. Like how much of it converts to a legal store as opposed to the legacy markets. And that plays out differently over time in each place.
Yeah. And so you're also, I think bringing up to, how do you dent the legacy market? Like you said, taxation, right? So Schumer's about to, we'll see what, there's some lag between we release or whatever. But, for Schumer, the CAWOA, since I like to lean into ridiculous, acronyms when politicians don't come up with things like climb, hope, or states are safe, it's like, who's Schumer's acronym guy? The one most interesting point to me was the increasing scale of taxes,
yes.
Right? Because logically, right, if you're trying to put a dent in a very established illicit market, how are you going to compete? You're going to compete on price, convenience, product quality, or product diversification ultimately.
Yes.
And to come in at a lower price point with a lower taxation rate would make a ton of sense, dent the illicit market effectively on price, beat it on the other, compete on convenience by having delivery, right? Because that's how people got it. Compete with them, on how they get it on-site consumption, which, typically isn't out there in the illicit market. And then, work your taxes up. But I feel like that's just not like feasible politically, because politicians who stick their neck out to any extent to push forward legalization love the idea of pointing to, look at all the tax revenue we brought in right from the beginning. And that's that doesn't have the, the foresight, the way the political system's constructed. It's now, I need to raise funds for the next election cycle. So I think that that's one kind of unfortunate thing that's a system that makes sense that I just don't think we potentially could ever see. And then the regulators who don't I like watching the notes about the Pennsylvania committees. They're talking about the states to learn from. And they're like, oh, hey, Michigan makes sense. California taxation, not as much sense. Like at least they took out, cultivation, but, quote unquote, revenue neutral dulls the impact ultimately in terms of being able to compete with the illicit market. So, I'm just curious to know about some of the little things that have, covering everything you have, like the quirky political outcomes, the unexpected ones. Like I thought Ohio was looking golden for the 2022 ballot until this deal was cut out of the blue, it seemed like, and pushed things back a year. Maryland, I had hoped that both things were going to, get on the ballot. And then, no, it's really just the decriminalization. So I'm curious to know what things have just kind of like caught your attention as either trends or little quirky things that you're just like, where'd this come from?
Yeah, it's interesting how each state has their own, path to legalization, and it's a very bumpy road. And I think the problem is that in each particular like state legislature or the governor's office, you have politicians who are still against it, that are still, really not in favor of it. So you do have the things with taxes that people say, well, I know you're against it, but look at how much money we could raise, and so that's the way to get it through. In Pennsylvania, we had a real weird situation where they legalized medical cannabis and they allowed, dabs and all sorts of concentrates, but they didn't allow flower in the beginning, which was completely weird. But
New
what
York
they
too,
did,
right?
What's that? Yeah.
New York too.
Right. Yeah. And so what they did, though, which was smart, was they said, we're going to review this in 6 months. So let's just, and the politicians said, we have to do something to get it past, the skeptical guys. And so they allowed it to go through without flower, but they convened a committee in 6 months. And of course, the committee unanimously agreed to put flower on the ballot or put flower in there. You also had like different medical conditions, for each state too. So that's another quirky thing that happens. Also in PA, they had a bunch of conditions and then they added anxiety. And then they ran out of weed a couple months later because everybody got, the number of people with medical cards went way up.
Every single lawyer in the entire state all of a sudden had a medical card, you're saying?
Exactly.
A way to get a medical card?
Yeah. I mean, it was like, who can't say they have anxiety? And so, I think what happens is like, just to get things started, you have to like appease certain elements of the political class. And the way I look at it too is it is bipartisan. Many times it's more the older politicians versus the younger ones, that are against it. So you have to please, the older politicians and really get something to pass, and then you can change the laws. Now, you did mention California. I think it's a big development with this cultivation tax change. And I don't know what the net effect is going to be huge, but it's just important to understand that people saw a big problem. The operators were having trouble making money. They brought up a solution, and the governor pushed it through. That's what we need to happen, because we know that these laws are not going to be perfect to start with. And, different market dynamics develop over time, and you need to be able to adjust them to have a more fair market.
Yeah. But the frustrating thing is when the new states come online, and every state's different, but you're just like, couldn't you just look around and see how these things played out? Look, I'm frankly, I think obviously a very interesting, we both sit on the East Coast. So, an interesting region, for us as the East Coast coming online. And, New York is very frustrating to me. I always give the disclaimer that regulators have the best of intentions, but this conditional retail program in New York is highly concerning in terms of anything new. You should fear in terms of unintended consequences. And this is so involved, not to mention that, a friend, we noticed that, the entire conditional retail program might actually be a violation from the beginning of language in MRTA. So there's the basis of a lawsuit. And lawsuits could have these huge impacts like, Illinois social equity program, or Oklahoma not having seed to sale for years because of a lawsuit that resulted in, say, the $500 million bust last year. So I'm curious to know your kind of thoughts, your, excitement about the East Coast coming online, and, how you think it might play out the next couple of years.
Very excited about it. I think it's a paradigm shift for the industry. For many years, it was all about California, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado. And, then now it's about New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. Maine is doing really well. Vermont is online now. Rhode Island just passed their laws. We have Maryland, which hopefully will move forward at some point soon. So I think that there's going to be, a huge amount of people, first of all. So the addressable market for legal adult use cannabis is going to go up by 30 or 40 million people in the next 2 years. So that right there is a big deal. We see a lot of brands coming from the West Coast that want to get going in New York naturally. And so that's going to affect things, but also just the financial impact to the industry. We have like 40 some companies in our portfolio. A lot of them are going to be aren't doing much now, but they're going to be moving towards the East Coast to do what they do. And that's going to really help them just expand their market share and customer base. So that's really exciting. I also think there's going to be this other effect of, Washington, D.C. And you mentioned before, like, the bills that are floating around D.C. and they have lukewarm support in different ways. I think once the East Coast really gets going and numbers start to pour in, I think you're going to see more movement in some of that legislation. I think it's first of all, it's closer to home. It's going to be everywhere. And it's really going to encompass 80% of the United States is going to have some sort of, or more, is going to have some sort of legal cannabis. So it's going to be harder for the representatives in DC to vote things down when their constituents, there's jobs, there's taxes, there's medicine, all being created in their home district. And then they go to DC to vote, and it's going to be harder to vote no.
Yeah, I agree 100% in terms of, New York coming online is a huge thing, the financial capital of the world.
Yeah.
Right. That's going to be really, really interesting. I'm curious with your thoughts, by the way, and level of experience in it. I keep encountering this stuff where the West Coast brands, there's almost like this cockiness or an assumption that they're just going to come in and dominate the East Coast. And the East Coast, has some pride. Celebrity brands are not what they necessarily were at the beginning, right? You're seeing the relaunches, like, the Tyson 2.0s. And West Coast brands have a point in that, you'll see them popping up through the illicit market on the East Coast because, hey, how much of the weed that the entire nation's been smoking for decades has come from California? I'm
Yeah.
curious to know your thoughts about West Coast brands versus East Coast brands in the East Coast as it develops.
Yeah, it's a great question because I think some brands are going to do really well and some are not. And I think part of it is quality and consistency. How do you recreate? It's not as easy to grow really quality weed indoors in New York as it is in Mendocino County. And so how do you find the right partner on the East Coast that could grow your flower or your edibles, and make them exactly the same? So that's going to be a challenge. That's number one. Number two is funding, like investment capital. So these brands need to raise money to get into, there's 4,000 brands in California. I'm sure almost all of them want to come to New York, but only a few of them are going to be really able to do it in the early going. Now, the advantage, the opportunity though, is that the brand awareness and the branding wars, so to speak, are really in the first inning out in the East Coast. So you do have the opportunity of creating a pretty big brand right away once the stores start to open. And that's why, we actually focus a lot on data in cannabis and what consumers are buying and how much of it and what brands are popular and form factors. And I think those trends are going to play out as the adult use markets get more developed here.
Yeah. I mean, it actually, it conjured up in my head. I moderated a panel, Benzinga, on the California market and California brands. And the other advantage that they have in terms of necessarily, the actual operational knowledge we talked about the California Crucible. Some of the companies on the panel, right, I guess they found the right partners, but it was almost the little things, right? Like there's the example I'll give is, Lowell Farms packaging, like the magnet, when I open it and close it, there's something visceral, right? There's always going to be, for people who are the connoisseurs, right? I still feel like it's always like, as you start encountering legal products until it really wears off, that you're entering Willy Wonka's factory with the golden ticket, right? That little, you want to feel like, the first time you really enjoyed weed kind of vibe. And so what they found is that when they went into new markets, some of these brands, they were surprised almost at how quickly they would rise to the top based on the little things and these like holistic approach that, it's just clicking in my head right now talking to you. That's this other advantage that a brand new East Coast, brand launching. I mean, you're going to have marketing people here that are more tuned, right, to the things that resonate. But that's another kind of competitive advantage coming out of mature markets that have been, fleshed out, that we'd be fighting. So that's interesting, right? You almost have to feel like the East Coast brands would have to fight that with a big enough, capital infusion to be widely available from the beginning almost. So that's or come in with some name brand recognition from scratch, like a really big celebrity to actively compete, right? I mean, I think I think it's gonna be fascinating to see how that kind of plays out. We're two geeks about this industry. You can tell. Here's another one that I think is going to be interesting, right? In terms of things that could push the needle. I like to cover pop polls in the podcast, right? So the East Coast coming online, a greater population coming in, New York, financial capital of the world. I've always been kind of curious, right? Do you think that on a national political level that it'll have any importance when you have we have Virginia, right, south of the Mason-Dixon line, when the first deep South state goes legal, adult use? And I'd be curious to know your pick, because I got my pick, and I'd love to know yours.
First, you're saying the first southern state, to go totally adult use, yes?
Yeah.
Well, I hope it's Florida.
Yeah, everyone hopes it's Florida.
But we're not sure about it yet. I mean, there's, North Carolina, South Carolina have talked. South Carolina is actually, trying to push it forward as well. But I still think Florida is going to be the big linchpin in the South, to really get it going. But it might not happen until 24 for adult use there. So let's hope it goes there. But it's also just really interesting the way the different regions of the country are slowly getting involved with it. And I think that I think the East Coast really getting all this going, is going to push more states in the South to get it going, because certainly we have, like, everyone from New York goes to Florida every summer, and
boobies and zadies
and the winter. I mean, yeah. But it's also, and I also just wanted to come back to one point that you mentioned is New York is the capital of the world financially, but also it's the advertising capital of the world. And so if you want to get a brand going nationally, you have to go through New York for your advertising. And I think that is going to bleed over into other states in the South and everywhere else. So, the dollars needed, you mentioned you need more money, but if you get going quickly in those markets, it will spread into these other markets, even in the South.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a great point. My dark horse is Louisiana.
Okay.
The polls, like there were Republican candidates, right, who conducted polls, and the numbers were great. Heck, the numbers are great in Texas. Some of the polls that have come in is a crazy thing. And if you talk about when that domino flips, like, holy crap.
Yes.
That's either, that will, if it hasn't happened yet, push federal, legality. I mean, obviously it's just such a big domino to fall. But certainly Florida is the most appealing, but there's such entrenched interests with the MSOs already. You have $1 billion medical market. And, so it's going to be interesting. Florida is unto itself, I think, as we've seen in national politics on that level. I want to touch upon something interesting also that you said, right, is the generational approach to all of this. That one of the things that you said impacted things on political level are older politicians. I talked to someone today who had been in a meeting with Mitch McConnell, right, post Farm Bill. And, you have Delta 8 out there. You have people going to the hospital with Delta 8. And I think Delta 8 has been such an interesting development for the industry, because you have state licensed programs now competing with a psychoactive cannabinoid being sold in gas stations and convenience stores. And there's certain people who are betting on that play. And he said that, Mitch McConnell had no idea.
Not surprised.
Right? It's interesting. And so, one story I found very interesting in analysis was about millennials, right? Mm-hmm. And circling back to what we said about, also cannabis by comparison to alcohol. Millennials now are the largest generation by population in this country, and they prefer cannabis over alcohol. So I'm curious to know, your thoughts, right, in terms of, it seems like it should only be a positive thing for the industry. But, with your emphasis on data and everything, what are your thoughts on that generational shift?
It's huge. It's huge. And I think once more millennials get in elected office, it's going to really tip the balance. The one thing that I figured out, like, many years ago, is every 2 years, everything changes. Congress changes and the voters change. Older voters die off and younger voters register to vote. And so what we see statistically is that the cannabis bills gain in percentage of approval every time. Florida, you had this situation, I think it was like 16 that it failed by a little bit, and then 18 had passed by a lot. I might have that a little off, but like every state, that brings it back up on the ballot like 2 years later, it gets approved by a wider margin. New Jersey was an example, like 66% or 68% of the vote, where a couple years earlier it didn't pass. And so I really believe that's because older politicians retire and younger ones, millennials and Gen Zers and stuff, they get in and they know that cannabis is safer than alcohol. They've experienced it. They've shifted in their own consumption habits. And so they don't have that old school mentality. We also have this stigma that started in 1970, which was, really not that long ago, but it's like it was ingrained in us that cannabis was a problem, and people just, were against it. I mean, I also really am interested in the senior citizen market, because when they were, when they were younger, it was cannabis was no good, but cigarettes and alcohol were fine.
Yep.
Now they've shifted, and now things have really changed where, people really understand that cannabis is a lot safer. And so I think that's, happening like every 2 years, but we need that's why the elections matter, really. Electing the right politicians that are in favor and that are younger is a game changer.
So that's interesting. Like touching upon that, like, do you think that there's the possibility, right, in this midterm election, could really skew things back to Republicans? Do you think that there's the potential that what could end up happening is a younger conservative politician on some larger national level is the one who ends up flipping the switch? Because the polling's there.
Yes.
Right. On a national level, right, the polling is there. I like to, talk about my Republican grandma statistics, right, in terms of like, convincing someone, to try and switch over. I mean, do you think that maybe that's what could end up, kind of unexpectedly having a huge impact on,
Yes.
This? Okay.
Absolutely. And that's what we really need to happen. We need more Republican votes for cannabis. And we have like Nancy Mace, for example, South Carolina, and she just won her primary. Like, we need her to win in November and keep pushing her bill, because it's important if it comes from the Republican side. So that's really important. We also need Republican governors to say yes and really get it going in their own states. It's interesting though, like, because we still have, like, in Pennsylvania, we have a really interesting Senate race, and cannabis is, a big part of it, because John Fetterman is very pro-cannabis. And if he wins, he's going to be one of the most pro-cannabis senators there.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Oz, Dr. Oz thinks that this was a ridiculous statement. He said that people don't work when they smoke weed, and it's going to cause more unemployment or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is really ridiculous, because cannabis creates thousands and thousands of jobs everywhere it goes. So that I don't understand that statement. So we still have Republican politicians that are stuck in that old school mentality. And we need more of them to come forward and say, you know what, this is a bipartisan issue. This is for, health benefits, for tax revenues, for job creation. So I think that's really what it takes. And I hate to say this, but we need a younger president too. I'm not picking sides here. I'm just saying I would like someone a little bit younger to take the White House, and that could really change things a lot quicker as well.
Yes, I don't think it's saying, getting into it, say that even to his supporters, I mean, to people in the industry, Biden has been an incredible disappointment. I mean, the fact of the matter is he hasn't fulfilled basic campaign promises in relation to the drug when he was the most conservative of all the Democratic candidates.
Yes.
I don't think we're stating something controversial there. It's just, purely a function of fact. So, when I did like kind of a deep dive federal analysis, kind of stripped everything away, we could tie this into, I'm curious for your thoughts on, how safe banking, say, gets through, right? A broad legalization package, I still think is unrealistic, right? Unless it comes, like you said, where there's Republican leadership and it's easier to convince Democrats to get on board on a national level. I'm curious to know what you think of, say, like what I've been calling super safe or, safe hope combination being something that could actually, I guess, the lame duck session, your thoughts in terms of how things might play out the remainder of the year or in the I guess, basically before the next, Congress comes in.
I think there's a good chance that it passes in a lame duck session. I do. I think safe banking is the one thing that they all can agree on. And it's the least, controversial among, the members of Congress. And I think there'll be enough support for it, and also, it ties back to the earlier point of money, like how do we help the businesses that are in our state, succeed? And all of them will be helped by safe banking. All the, the investment dollars will flow more freely for, for funding needs and things like that. And so I think that there's more support for that than there is for this current Schumer thing that he's bringing up right now. And I think that that's got a better chance of happening. However, I've been wrong about this before, because I thought when, the Democrats took over all three branches, I thought at least we'd get safe banking, before the midterms. And it doesn't look like that'll happen. But, I think it's encouraging that there's more Republicans speaking out in favor of it. And I think there's a good chance we'll get it passed. Let me add one other thing, though.
Yeah.
The midterms, what happens in the midterms will definitely affect it. So the Republicans are likely to take a lot of seats back. But as you said, maybe there'll be support, from the Republican side, but maybe there won't. So it could slow things down, but I hope not.
And when I did the deep dive, I think to a certain extent it comes down to voter demographics, right? The communities that have been disproportionately impacted, right, by the war on drugs are Democratic voting blocks.
Yes.
Right. They're not as much of a priority, obviously, for conservatives and Republicans. And there's this little quirky thing about, conservatives and Republicans that they favor states' rights over federal, and yet, something like the States Act hasn't passed through. So it's terms of how do you sell this, right? If it's Democrats in control, right? I was seeing here, if you want any business, banking, despite the fact that banking is a huge issue for minority business owners, for everyone in the industry, it actually creates unsafe, conditions, pun intended. And unfortunately, people have died. That if Dems are in control, that any of that incremental progress in that regard has to be tied to some type of, social equity consideration, like if SAFE is combined with HOPE relating to expungements. And if it's Republicans control, a generational thing, is kind of important, then it's not the, as I like to call them, the marijuana no-betters leading things. It's the people that have been raised with that, as you touched upon, that idea that just awareness that marijuana is not as harmful as alcohol from any direction that you look at it. And also say the Republicans, take back both houses. Does Biden, end up, does he agree to kind of on a compromise to reach across the aisle on something when they had that opportunity for the past 2 years with complete Democratic control? I'm curious to know your thoughts of fully Republican controlled Congress, compromise with Biden potential.
Unfortunately, I don't see Biden doing a lot in his time. I don't. And I wish I could answer you differently, but I do think there's a chance that the Republicans pass something, maybe not. I think sometimes the problems the Democrats have is overreaching and trying to put too many things into one bill and trying to fix all the problems in cannabis in one shot. And that's what Schumer's doing this week, with his new bill. And I think that's a mistake because you're always going to have some people that push back against that. I think it's better if it happens in stages and happens with the bill, the SAFE bill, the Climb Act, things like that. And then I think, you'll shift the thinking and you'll shift the money factor, and then you might have a better shot. Now, Biden is practical, and he does like to, have bipartisan support for things. So it is possible that if Republicans come out in support of things, that he'll jump on board. But I still think he has this, age bias against cannabis. He fought the drug war, the war on drugs in the 70s and 80s. And I think he doesn't want to go back on that, at this point in his time. So that's definitely going to remain a problem. I do think that 2024 is going to be a huge leap forward in general. So my hope is that we get through the midterms, we pass SAFE, we pass a few other things, and then we have a lot more momentum into the 24 cycle, when I believe it'll come up a lot in the presidential race.
Because it's a political win sitting there based on the polling, right? Ultimately, it's like, why are they not taking it? That's Biden, I think, I'll be honest, as something said, I think it's psychological in relation to Hunter and his addiction struggles, right? Biden has that, we're talking about that antiquated viewpoint. Maybe he's got that gateway drug mentality, because maybe how things played out with Hunter possibly. And that might be the bridge, the reason why he can't cross the bridge, ultimately. I agree in terms of 2024 could be huge, hopefully, ultimately, and it being an issue that gets discussed at some point in, presidential campaigns with more emphasis.
By the way, why do we say, sorry, John, why don't we talk about alcohol as the gateway drug? I understood that.
Right. I mean, from my logic class, right, back in college, right, you could call alcohol a gateway. Great point. Not made enough. right?
Yeah.
You know, it's just like kind of the whole concept of gateway drug and correlation versus causation is just frustrating to someone whose job is based around logical arguments.
Yes.
Any, last points you want to touch upon before we close out?
Sure. Well, I just wanted to say that despite the stops and starts and the challenges that are going on with the regulatory standpoint, the future is very bright for cannabis. The businesses, when it fixes it, when things get going, things go really well. The one thing that we've seen in the established markets, first of all, we see huge revenues. They're always bigger than the predictions. Like, oh my God, Illinois did more, cannabis taxes than alcohol taxes. That's not a surprise to me. So I think that's going to play out in every legal market. I think once we start to get numbers from the East Coast, people are going to be blown away. And I think it's, the business of cannabis is doing extremely well. It's still a very good investment opportunity. Even though the public markets have not had a good year, that doesn't stop. We're full speed ahead at Panther. We're looking at investments every day of the week, and we believe that we know where the future is headed. I'd like it to come a little faster, but I'm pretty convinced about what this industry is going to look like in a couple of years. There's no going backwards. It's just a question of how fast we can move forward.
I think that's a fantastic way of putting it. A really, really great way to put it. A great way to end the conversation. So, Scott, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Scott Berman from the Panther Group. Thank you, and stay grassy, my buds.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it.